They said you were overthinking, that you were too intense, too emotional, too sensitive. Every time you pointed out the inconsistencies, the energy shifts, the silent betrayals, they looked at you like you were crazy, like your instincts were imaginary. They smirked when you spoke from the heart, rolled their eyes when you questioned things that didn't add up, told you to relax, to stop creating problems, to let it go. You were labeled dramatic, difficult, too much. And yet, somewhere deep inside you knew what you were feeling wasn't fiction. It was the truth disguised as intuition. You felt the betrayal before it had a name. You felt the energy shift before the lies ever left their mouth. And the worst part, you stayed. Not because you didn't see it, but because you kept hoping they'd finally see you. But they didn't. They dismissed your warnings like background noise, treated your care like control, your love like possession, your honesty like attack. You tried to explain, tried to be calm, tried to reason. Again and again you gave them chances. You watered their garden even when they gave you drought. You softened your voice even when theirs turned sharp. You bent so far you began to break, but still you stayed. Not because you were blind, but because you were loyal. Not because you didn't see the red flags, but because you thought, maybe, just maybe, they'd change once they realized your heart was never the enemy. But now you're quiet. Now you've got nothing to say, but because you've said it all, too many times to people who never truly listened. Now you've stepped back, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. You've walked away, not to punish, but to protect what's left of your peace. And the silence you leave behind, it's loud now, deafening, echoing in the same places where your truth was once laughed at. Because the day always comes. That day when the very people who doubted you suddenly start to see what you saw. When the truth they dismissed comes back like a storm they can't outrun. And it hits them in a conversation, in a memory, in a moment when the mask finally slips off someone else, and they whisper to themselves, "Damn, they were right. Yes, you were right." But by then, you'll be gone. Gone from the spaces that drained you. Gone from the rooms where your voice was silenced. Gone from the lives that couldn't hold your value until it slipped through their hands. And when that day comes, when the apologies echo into emptiness, when your absence is louder than any closure, they'll finally say what you knew all along. But by then, you'll have already outgrown the version of you who needed to hear it. You warned them, not in anger, not with raised voices or dramatic ultimatums. You didn't throw it in their face or write it across the sky. You warned them softly, gently, even when your heart was breaking. You tried to speak your truth in whispers because you never wanted to hurt them. You wanted to help them see what you saw, to understand what you were feeling. When the energy shifted, you felt it first. When the loyalty cracked, you noticed the silence. You pointed it out with trembling honesty, hoping someone, anyone, would take it seriously. But every time you spoke, they shrugged it off, brushed past your intuition like it was background noise in a conversation about nothing. You asked questions with compassion, raised concerns without accusation, and still they called you paranoid, dramatic, controlling, too sensitive, overthinking again. You weren't trying to fight. You were trying to save what mattered, trying to hold on to something real. But they mistook your clarity for conflict. They acted like your ability to sense the storm was you creating the thunder. You saw things they didn't want to face, and instead of leaning in, they pulled away. Instead of hearing you, they silenced you, gaslit you, made you question the very truth you were trying to protect. You tried to explain how you were feeling, but they didn't want to understand. They just wanted you to stop talking. You tried to give them a map to your heart, to show them where it was hurting, where it was soft, where it was starting to dim. But they didn't read it. They didn't take the time. They told you it was all in your head, that you were doing too much, that nothing's wrong, when deep down you knew everything had changed. And so you began to retreat, slowly, not physically, but emotionally. Every time your truth was met with dismissal, your voice got a little quieter. Every time they rolled their eyes at your concern, you learned to swallow it. Not because it went away, but because expressing it began to feel like a crime. You started having full conversations in your head, conversations you knew wouldn't be received the way they deserved to be. So you held it in. And in doing so, you began to shrink. You started second-guessing yourself. Maybe you were being too emotional. Maybe you were expecting too much. Maybe this is what love is supposed to feel like. Heavy, uncertain, one-sided. But deep down, you knew better. You saw the signs, the messages left on red, the tone change in their voice, the distance in their replies, the way they only came close when they needed something, never when you did. The way your name only left their mouth when it was convenient, never when it mattered. You saw the inconsistencies, the micro-shifts, the subtle disappearances. You saw the way they stopped checking in, the way they started forgetting the details you used to carry like scripture. The energy was off, and you knew it. But when you said something, they made you feel like you were losing your mind. You warned them when their words started contradicting their actions, when the warmth faded and was replaced with cold formality. You pointed out how love doesn't feel like walking on eggshells, how connection doesn't feel like confusion, how loyalty doesn't feel like silence. You gave them a chance to correct it, to come clean, to reconnect, to show up, but they didn't. They laughed at your heart like it was a punchline. They treated your emotional intelligence like it was a glitch instead of a gift. And the more you tried to make sense of it, the more they pulled away. The more you tried to hold on, the more they made you feel like the problem. You weren't perfect. You never claimed to be. But your intentions were pure. You weren't trying to control them. You were trying to connect. You weren't trying to expose them. You were trying to heal what was breaking. But in their world, truth was inconvenient. Vulnerability was too loud. So they shut the door on your softness and called it peace. And eventually, you stopped knocking. Not because you stopped caring, but because you realized that some people will never understand the value of a warning until the storm hits. Some people will only feel the weight of your words when the silence replaces them. You warned them from a place of love, but they chose ignorance like armor. They chose denial like a pillow to rest their pride on. And now all that's left is the echo of everything you tried to say. They'll remember the things you mentioned once, casually, quietly, with concern. The tiny truths you laid down gently, hoping they'd pick them up and hold them close. They'll think about how you were always 2 steps ahead, not because you wanted to be right, but because you wanted to protect what was sacred. They'll recall the conversations where you looked them in the eye and said, "Something's not right." And they'll remember how they rolled their eyes, smirked, shrugged, changed the subject. One day, they'll replay those moments, like scenes in a movie they've already seen but never paid attention to. They'll remember the tone in your voice, the tension in your silence, the hope in your eyes when you still believed they would listen. And when they realize that you weren't accusing them, you were warning them. It'll hit them like a wave they never saw coming. But by then you'll be gone. Gone from the conversation, gone from the dynamic, gone from the illusion they tried to keep you trapped in, and what's left behind, only the truth they tried to bury, and the silence that now screams everything you once whispered. You knew better, long before things collapsed, long before the silence turned loud, before the warmth in their voice went cold. You knew, not because someone told you, not because the signs were written in bold letters, but because your spirit whispered it, quietly, repeatedly, gently. You felt it in their distance, in the way they started choosing convenience over conversation, in the way their eyes stopped meeting yours with the same fire. You noticed it, you sensed it. Your intuition stood in front of you, waving red flags. But you stayed, not because you didn't see, but because you didn't want to believe what you saw. You stayed because your heart was louder than your instincts, because your love still had hope, even when logic had already left the room. You stayed because your heart had a habit of finding the best in people, even when they were showing you their worst, because you believed in what they could be, not what they kept proving they were. You held on to potential like it was proof. You replayed the good moments, the laughs, the early days, hoping they would outweigh the growing weight of neglect. You convinced yourself they were just going through something, that they would come back around, that the connection wasn't fading, it was just flickering, that all relationships had rough patches and this was just yours. But in your gut, you knew the difference between growing pains and emotional starvation. And still, you stayed. You told yourself it would get better, that they would wake up one day and finally see you, that they would remember your loyalty, your softness, your sacrifices, that they would come back with clarity in their eyes and honesty on their tongue. But they never did. You waited on apologies that never came. You begged for clarity through silence. You held on to hope like it was rope, but it only burned your hands the longer you clung to it. And they took your staying as permission, as proof that they could get away with less and still keep you, that your forgiveness had no expiration date, that your love had no limits. They started showing up empty and still expected you to pour. They brought chaos and still demanded your peace. They turned your kindness into currency and spent it carelessly. And you stayed anyway, because somewhere in your soul, you believed that love was supposed to endure. You thought strength meant staying. You thought giving up meant failing. But no one told you that staying can be self-harm when the other person is only showing up to take. You carried both sides of the connection, their silence and your effort, their apathy and your presence, their distance and your faith. You kept showing up, even when it felt like they were already halfway out the door. You silenced your doubts. You ignored your own needs. You convinced yourself you were asking for too much when, deep down, you were only asking for the bare minimum: respect, honesty, consistency. And yet, even that felt like too much to them, so you lowered the bar, again and again, until you were crawling just to keep the connection alive. But your body felt it, the exhaustion, the weight, the emotional depletion that comes from always being the one who cares more. You woke up tired, not from lack of sleep, but from carrying a connection that had already let you go. You started questioning yourself. Was it you? Were you too emotional, too needy, too intense? But it wasn't you. It was the silence they offered when you needed answers, the games they played when you needed truth, the way they kept you just close enough to keep you hoping, but far enough to keep you from ever truly feeling held. You started shrinking to stay, dimming your light to make them feel comfortable, biting your tongue to avoid arguments. You stopped asking questions, stopped expressing your needs, stopped showing them where it hurt, because what was the point? You already knew how they would respond. With silence, with dismissal, with defensiveness. So you suffered quietly. And that silence, it became your prison. You were trapped inside love that didn't love you back, inside promises that were never honored, inside moments that replayed in your mind with a pain they'd never understand. You stayed, because you saw their wounds, because you believed they were healing, because you thought your love could be the bandage. But love is not a rehab center. It's not your job to fix someone who refuses to acknowledge they're broken. It's not your responsibility to carry trauma that's not yours. You thought you were helping, but you were bleeding. You thought you were building, but you were breaking. You were trying to grow flowers in soil that had no intention of blooming. You stayed too long, not because you were weak, but because you were hopeful, because you believed in the idea of what could be more than you accepted what is. You believed if you loved them harder, deeper, longer, they would finally see your worth. But love is not a transaction. You can't love someone into respecting you. You can't pour enough into someone who is content with letting you run dry. And you can't build a future with someone who keeps walking backwards. Eventually, something inside you broke, but not in the way they thought. It wasn't a meltdown. It wasn't a rage-filled goodbye. It was a quiet snap. A slow, sobering realization that you were holding on to something that was never holding you back. That your staying was no longer noble, it was self-destruction. And that clarity, it came with grief. Because leaving wasn't just about walking away from them. It was about mourning the version of you who tolerated so much in the name of love. You stayed too long, but not one moment longer than it took to finally see yourself again. And that was the beginning of your return. You didn't scream. You didn't shatter the silence with accusations or flood the room with your final words. There was no door slammed, no drama, no drawn-out explanation. When you let go, it was quiet, eerily quiet. A kind of silence that wasn't empty but full. Full of truths you stopped trying to prove. Full of tears you had already cried in private. Full of peace you finally decided to reclaim. They didn't see it coming, not because you didn't warn them, but because they never believed you would actually leave. They thought you were permanent. They mistook your loyalty for dependence, your silence for surrender. But what they didn't understand was that your quiet wasn't weakness, it was preparation. And when the moment finally came, it wasn't rage that fueled your exit, it was clarity. That day, everything was still. You weren't shaking, you weren't unsure. You just knew. You woke up and something inside you had shifted. You looked around and the space that once felt like home now felt like a cage. You listened to the conversations, the empty gestures, the hollow check-ins, and it all sounded like noise. And you realized this wasn't love. Not anymore. Maybe it never was. Maybe it was just your love holding everything together. Your effort, your consistency, your hope. You looked at yourself in the mirror that morning and saw someone tired, not from lack of rest, but from carrying what was never reciprocated. You had begged for honesty, and they gave you silence. You had shown up with heart, and they met you with convenience. And you stayed, you gave, you tried. Until trying became too expensive. There was no dramatic goodbye, just a moment, one long, still moment when your soul whispered, "It's time." And for once, you listened. You stopped texting first. You stopped explaining yourself. You stopped offering second chances to people who didn't even ask for them. You stopped waiting for a version of them that only lived in your imagination. And that was the moment. The one where you didn't flinch. The day you let go, you finally stopped begging for closure from someone who had already closed the door. You finally accepted that you were not too much. You were just too real for someone who wasn't ready. You were too deep for someone who only knew how to swim in the shallow end. You were too whole for someone who only ever showed up in pieces. And you realized that you were shrinking just to make them feel tall, dimming your light so they wouldn't have to confront their own darkness, loving them like they were a masterpiece, while they treated you like a placeholder. Letting go didn't mean you stopped caring. It just meant you started caring about yourself more. It meant you stopped romanticizing their potential and started honoring your reality. It meant you chose peace over pretending. And that peace didn't come in a sudden wave. It came slowly, softly. It came in the way you no longer reacted when their name popped up, in the way your chest didn't tighten at memories that used to steal your breath. It came in the way you stopped needing an apology to move forward, because you gave yourself the closure they were never brave enough to offer. You let go without burning bridges, without bitterness. You didn't need revenge. You didn't need them to feel what you felt, because deep down, you knew one day they would. One day they'd sit in a quiet room and feel the absence of your energy. One day, someone else would say the same words you once whispered, and they'd hear them differently, because this time, it would be too late. You didn't need them to say you were right while you were still there. You let go knowing the silence you left behind would do all the speaking for you, and that's the part they'll never forget. You didn't explode. You evaporated. You became a presence that once filled the room and now filled their thoughts. You became the voice they silenced, now echoing in their conscience. You became the heart they broke, now beating in freedom far from their reach. You became the mirror they refused to look into, now reflecting all the ways they failed to show up. And while they sit in their old patterns, you've stepped into a new life, one where your peace isn't up for compromise, because the cost of staying was your identity, and the reward of leaving yourself. Letting go wasn't weakness, it was rebirth. It was remembering who you were before they convinced you to settle. It was coming home to your worth, your power, your joy. You weren't walking away from love. You were walking toward it, the kind that doesn't come with conditions, the kind that doesn't make you question your place, the kind that feels like rest, not resistance. And maybe they'll never say the words, maybe they'll never send the text or make the call. But in the quiet moments, when the lights are off and the masks are down, they'll feel it. The difference, the void, the loss. They'll remember the peace you brought, the presence you offered, the way your love was patient, deep, and undemanding. They'll remember that they didn't just lose someone who cared. They lost someone who warned them, who tried, who gave them every chance to do better. But now it's too late. Because when you finally let go, it wasn't about them anymore. It was about choosing you, and you chose well. They laughed. Oh, how they laughed. When you chose silence over spectacle, when you stopped showing up, when you distanced yourself without explanation. They laughed because they mistook your withdrawal for weakness. They thought you had folded, that you'd lost, that the quiet meant surrender. But what they didn't know was that your silence wasn't a sign of defeat. It was a sign of discipline. You weren't disappearing. You were rebuilding. While they spent their energy tearing down others to feel tall, you were building something sacred beneath the surface, something strong, something rooted in truth. You stopped explaining, stopped arguing, stopped handing over your soul in exchange for temporary validation. They kept trying to provoke a reaction, trying to get a rise out of you so they could paint you as the emotional one. But instead of responding, you redirected. You took all the pain, all the frustration, all the disappointment, and you turned it inward. Not to bury it, but to repurpose it. While they mocked your absence, you were laying bricks. Quietly, carefully, consistently. Every day they talked, you toiled. Every insult became a lesson. Every betrayal became a boundary. You stopped proving. You stopped performing. They were too busy chasing clout, dressing up their egos, performing for rooms full of strangers. But you were planting seeds, and seeds don't make noise when they grow. Roots don't rise with applause. While they were out there, soaking up borrowed sunlight, you were learning how to build your own. You were studying yourself, healing yourself, investing in your future, one silent, sacred moment at a time. They partied while you prepared. They posted while you practiced. They laughed while you learned. They used your name like a punchline, never realizing that every joke they cracked was just adding fuel to your fire. You weren't trying to convince them of your worth anymore. You were becoming it. You were carving out clarity while they were clinging to confusion. You were reintroducing yourself to peace while they were drowning in. They thought the storm had taken you out. But the storm built you. It stripped away the illusions, the distractions, the noise. It forced you to sit with yourself. And that silence. It taught you more than their chaos ever could. You learned how to breathe again, how to move differently, how to stand in your truth without needing applause. You realized that growth doesn't always come with witnesses. Sometimes the most important transformations happen in solitude, away from the eyes of those who never cared to understand you in the first place. They watched you break, but they never stayed long enough to see you rebuild. Because that part, the rebuilding, it wasn't flashy. It wasn't public. It wasn't for them. It was for you. You rebuilt with broken hands and a steady heart. You stitched together the pieces they left behind with golden thread. You turned every "you're not enough" into fuel, every "you'll never make it" into momentum. You turned their absence into space for growth, their silence into music for your healing, their laughter into background noise while you wrote a new story with your name on the cover. And now look. You walk differently, not arrogantly, but with alignment. You speak differently, not loudly, but with certainty. You no longer chase rooms that make you feel small. You no longer beg for people to love you right. You no longer argue with those committed to misunderstanding you. Because you've seen what happens when you pour into yourself instead of pouring into people who leave you empty. You've tasted peace, real peace. And once you've had that, chaos becomes too loud to tolerate. They still laugh, but it's nervous now. It's uncertain, because they see the glow in your quiet, the calm in your stride, the power in your absence. You're not bitter, you're better. You didn't get louder, you got clearer, and that clarity, that's what they never expected. They thought you'd always be explaining yourself, justifying your feelings, apologizing for having standards. But now you simply walk away, not to prove a point, but because you no longer have anything to prove. You were growing while they were gossiping. You were rising while they were ridiculing. You were manifesting while they were mocking. And now they sit with the realization that, while they underestimated you, you were quietly becoming everything they said you couldn't be. You became the blueprint, the example, the one who chose healing over drama, peace over pride, growth over games. You were the one they laughed at for being too soft, too forgiving, too deep. But the truth is, they just weren't ready for someone real. They weren't equipped to handle someone who felt everything deeply and still chose to love anyway. They couldn't comprehend your strength, so they called it weakness. They couldn't understand your silence, so they called it retreat. They couldn't handle your vision, so they called it delusion. But now they scroll through your progress with eyes full of what-ifs and hearts full of regret. Because the tables didn't just turn. You rebuilt them. And the seat you used to beg for, you built your own table instead. You no longer wait to be chosen. You no longer shrink to fit into spaces you've outgrown. You no longer explain your worth in languages not meant for people who never planned to listen. You are not angry. You're focused. You are not broken. You are becoming. And every laugh they once aimed at your downfall now echoes back at them, hollow and powerless. Because now, your growth is the loudest thing in the room. They didn't feel it at first. Not all at once. That's the thing about the kind of shift that comes after someone real leaves. It creeps in slowly, quietly, like a fog wrapping around familiar places and making them feel strange. At first, they convinced themselves it was just a phase, that things were fine, that your silence didn't matter. They told themselves they didn't need you, because that's what pride does. It masks pain with pretending. It dresses wounds with denial. But cracks started forming where certainty once lived, and the air around them began to feel heavier without you in it. They started noticing little things, the way conversations no longer felt anchored, how laughter felt forced and fleeting, how the people around them clapped loud but never listened. They missed the sound of your voice, not because it was loud, but because it was honest, real, grounding. You had this way of saying exactly what they didn't know they needed to hear. And now, in your absence, the noise around them felt shallow. Every conversation was a performance, but they couldn't find the stage anymore, because you were the only one who ever made chaos feel like calm. You became the voice in their head that they used to ignore, now whispering louder than ever. Every moment you tried to guide them, to protect them, to tell them what they didn't want to hear, it echoes now, louder in the silence than it ever did when you were right beside them. They remember brushing off your concerns, laughing at your intuition, dismissing your care as too much, because now they feel it, the weight of your absence. Not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally, energetically. You were never just a body in the room, you were the energy, the anchor, the one who held things down even when no one saw you breaking. And now that you're gone, the room doesn't just feel empty, it feels off balance. There's no grounding force, no gentle reminders, no late-night honesty. They scroll through their contacts and realize no one matches your depth. No one listens the way you did. No one stays calm when the storm hits. You did that, and they let it go. They're trying to move on, of course, posting, laughing, pretending, but it's not sticking the way it used to. They go out, surround themselves with noise, fill their schedules. But when the lights go down, when it's quiet, when it's just them and the mirror, they feel it. The echo of your presence. Not haunting in a ghostly way, but in a deeply human way. Like warmth they didn't appreciate until it turned to cold. Like sunlight they thought would last forever. But now they can't remember how it felt. They're starting to remember things they thought they forgot. The little things. The way you used to check on them when they were silent. The way you remembered details they never even told you mattered. The way you made ordinary days feel safe. And now safety feels like a stranger. They're surrounded by people, but no one sees them. Not like you did. No one feels them. Not deeply. Not fully. They tried to replace you, but everything else feels like a copy with the colors washed out. It's not just that they miss you. It's that they're starting to realize they never really knew you until you left. And that realization, it stings. Because they start replaying moments with new clarity, all the times they brushed off your feelings, all the moments you gave them your best while they gave you their bare minimum, all the times you asked for honesty and they handed you half-truths. They see it now. They feel it now. You weren't overreacting, you weren't dramatic. You were holding on when everything around you said, let go. And now that you're no longer holding space for them, they feel the drop. It's a slow unraveling. They try to laugh it off, distract themselves, but the truth keeps catching up. Because regret is patient, and it doesn't need an invitation. It shows up in the quiet, when the world stops spinning, when they're alone in bed scrolling through old messages, wondering how things went so wrong without a final fight. And the answer? It's simple. There was no fight because you were done fighting. For someone who made you feel like you were the problem. They're starting to realize now that they didn't lose someone who loved them. They lost someone who taught them how to love, who showed up fully, who was willing to break cycles and build bridges and have the hard conversations. But instead of matching your energy, they mocked it. Instead of appreciating your heart, they underestimated it. And now they live with the memory of someone who asked for so little but gave so much. But the hardest part, the part that gnaws at them when no one's watching, is that they know they can't go back. That even if they tried, they're not reaching the same version of you. Because this version of you, the one they're starting to see clearly through the lens of absence, is gone. You evolved. You moved on. You outgrew the story they kept rewriting in their head. And no matter how loud their regret becomes, it can't bridge the silence you left behind. That silence isn't empty. It's full of everything they chose to ignore, everything they once took for granted. It's filled with your love, your insight, your protection. It's filled with everything real. And now, the shift has happened. Not in you, but in them. And it's the kind of shift that doesn't get reversed, because once you see what you lost, you can never unsee it. And they've seen it now. You're no longer reachable. Not in the way they remember, not in the way they expect. The version of you they used to know, the one who would drop everything just to explain, to fix, to prove their heart was real. That version has quietly died, and in its place, a new you. One wrapped in silence, in self-respect, in power that doesn't shout, doesn't argue, doesn't chase. You didn't disappear to punish them. You just evolved into someone they never thought you'd become, untouchable. Not in arrogance, but in clarity. They want to reach you now, but you're not where they left you. You've grown too much to go back, not because you're holding a grudge, but because the door you once held open with trembling hands no longer exists. You burned it, quietly, and then built a wall where your boundaries once bent too far. You didn't do it out of spite. You did it because your peace finally meant more than being understood by people who never listened. You used to explain everything, your feelings, your tears, your silence. But now your silence explains it all. You don't raise your voice anymore. You don't justify your absence. You don't return messages laced in nostalgia. You simply stay gone. And they feel that louder than any argument ever could. They want closure. Of course they do. But you are the closure. You're the unanswered message, the quiet timeline, the read but not replied, the shift in energy they never thought they'd feel from you. You're the cold space they now have to sit in, wondering how warmth could disappear without a trace. They want to ask questions, not because they care about your pain, but because they're uncomfortable with their own. They want to talk things through, now that you're out of reach, now that they no longer have access to the version of you that would have welcomed their half-effort with open arms. But that version, she's gone, and the current you doesn't explain herself to echoes. There's something terrifying about being on the other end of someone's glow-up, especially when that glow-up involves distance. They once laughed at your emotions, called you sensitive, said you were overthinking. But now that your light isn't there to warm them, their world feels colder. You used to be available in every sense, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. You were the place they came to unload their burdens while ignoring your silence. But you've rebuilt yourself now, and with that rebirth came detachment. Now they can't read you, can't find you, can't shake the feeling that they lost something they'll never replace. And it's not that you hate them. No, that would mean you still feel something. The truth is, they just don't exist in your world anymore. You don't check on them. You don't wonder what they're doing. You've stopped imagining apologies, stopped replaying conversations. You've accepted the apology that never came, and you've let go of the version of them that only lived in your hopes. That's why you're unreachable, because you don't need their validation to heal anymore. You stopped bleeding for people who never noticed your wounds. You outgrew the places where your spirit was suffocating. You didn't leave them. You found yourself. And in finding yourself, they lost access to you. There's a calmness in your absence now, a sharp, haunting kind of calm that lingers longer than your presence ever did. They scroll through old messages, through photos, through timelines, trying to piece together where it went wrong. But they won't find it, because what broke wasn't sudden. It was slow. It was in the unanswered, "How are you?" texts. It was in the laughter that came after your vulnerability. It was in every moment they dismissed your truth to protect their ego. You were slipping away while they were comfortable, and now that they finally see it, they can't reach you. You don't block them because you're bitter. You block them because you're disciplined.
Because healing is sacred, and you're not letting them interrupt that anymore.
You're not giving them backdoor access into your peace. You're not explaining to them what they used to mock.
They had the chance to meet you where you were, and they chose to stand still.
So now they get to watch your life unfold from the outside, with no control, no input, and no invitation back. Your silence is fluent now. You speak it with ease. You no longer argue because you realize arguing is for the unheard, and you're not begging anyone to hear you anymore. You no longer wait, because waiting is for the uncertain, and you've never been more certain of your worth.
You've stopped walking on eggshells. Now you walk on purpose, with direction, with power, with standards that don't bend for apologies dipped in manipulation.
They thought you'd always be available, that no matter how far they pushed, you'd always come back, that no matter how they treated you, you'd always stay soft. But the softest hearts grow teeth when neglected. And now yours has become a fortress. They want to knock, but there's no door. They want to text, but your number changed. They want to reach you, but you've stopped existing in the dimensions they live in. Now they hear your name and feel a knot in their chest. Now they hear your silence and feel everything they once avoided. Now they sit in rooms filled with noise but feel lonelier than they ever did when you were near, because they finally understand that proximity isn't presence. You were the presence. You were the soul. The rare kind, the kind that doesn't return once disrespected. And they played themselves thinking you'd always be there. But you're not. You're not angry. You're not cold. You're not spiteful. You're unreachable, and that's what haunts them most. It hits them in the quiet, not during the chaos, not in the moments when the crowd's around or the music's too loud. No, it lands when everything stops, when the room is still, when the lights are low, and the only sound is the weight of their own thoughts crawling back to them like ghosts. That's when it hits. That's when the words they once brushed off, rolled their eyes at, scoffed over, come crashing back like a wave they never saw building. Damn, they were right.
It slips out softly, maybe whispered.
Maybe just a breath, but it cuts through the silence like a knife.
They don't say it to anyone.
They can't. Their pride still cages their honesty. But inside they're breaking in all the places they pretended didn't exist. They replay every warning you gave, the ones you didn't shout, but whispered in hope. The ones wrapped in love, not judgment. You didn't predict their downfall. You tried to prevent it. You didn't speak from a place of ego. You spoke from experience. You saw the patterns. You saw the hurt coming before it arrived. You tried to help, to guide, to hold space for them, in a world that only offered noise. But they didn't listen. They thought you were overreacting, too emotional, too dramatic, too deep. But now, those same truths echo in their head, like prophecies fulfilled. And the worst part, they can't even tell you you were right, because you're gone. They scroll through old messages now, not for nostalgia, for understanding, trying to trace back the exact moment they lost you. They read your words through new eyes, clearer eyes, eyes forced open by regret. The "Are you okay?" they left unanswered. The "I just want what's best for you" they called controlling. The "I'm here if you need me" they took for granted. It's all there, written in love, soaked in sincerity, and now, heavy, with meaning they never bothered to unpack. They scroll slower now, trying to touch your presence through text bubbles. But it's no longer comfort. It's evidence of how blind they were, of how much you cared, of how much they didn't. They remember the look in your eyes during the last few conversations. You weren't angry. You were disappointed. You were tired of speaking to someone who wasn't ready to listen. And even when your voice started breaking, your soul stayed soft. You didn't fight to be right. You fought to be understood. You weren't trying to win an argument. You were trying to stop the storm before it hit. But the storm wasn't yours to carry. You finally realized that, and you let it fall. And now, as they sit in the ruins, they hear your voice, not with irritation, but with aching clarity. It's not just the message they remember. It's the messenger, the way you said things that didn't make sense to them then, but live in their bones now. They'll hurt you the same way you ignore them now. If you don't deal with your pain, it will deal with you. One day, silence will be the only answer left. It all seemed so intense back then, but now those lines play back like scripture, like They watch your life unfold from a distance now. You're thriving, not loudly, not in some performative display of revenge, but in quiet peace. You're glowing in ways they never imagined, not because of them, but in spite of them. You're not proving anything to anyone anymore. You've made peace with being misunderstood in the past because clarity now lives in their mind, not on your shoulders. They carry the truth like a stone in their chest. You were right. But now you're unreachable. Not because you ran, but because you rose. And it's not your "I told you so" they hear. It's your absence. Your absence has a voice now. It speaks in every lonely night they scroll through pictures they never thought they'd miss. It speaks in the moments when something reminds them of you, and there's no way to reach out. It speaks in the silence after they say your name in their mind, wishing they had listened sooner. It says everything you don't have to. The echo of "you were right" isn't just haunting, it's healing. For you. Because you no longer need validation. No longer need closure. The justice was never in the apology. It was in your evolution. The haunting is theirs. The peace is yours. They thought you'd stay broken. They thought you'd never find yourself outside of their shadow. They mistook your silence for surrender, your peace for passivity. But what they never accounted for was your transformation, the way you rose, quietly, patiently, powerfully. The way you pulled yourself out of that chaos they left you in, and rebuilt, brick by brick, not just a new life, but a new you. And now, look at you, no longer explaining, no longer chasing. You walk with clarity, you breathe with purpose. You live in a space of your own making, a life not just healed, but thriving. They don't recognize you anymore, and that's exactly how it was always meant to be. You've become everything they said you couldn't be, without them. You've created stability, not because it was handed to you, but because you decided you deserved it. You've surrounded yourself with peace, not because the world suddenly became softer, but because you stopped letting the world into places it didn't earn. Your boundaries became your blueprint. Your silence became sacred. You learned how to say no, not with anger, but with elegance. You stopped watering dead gardens and began planting your own, and now they bloom in colors you once only dreamed of. You're no longer trying to prove your heart to people who misread it. You've stopped begging to be seen by eyes that refused to open. You don't text long paragraphs. You don't hope for closure. You don't explain your worth. The people around you now, they don't just see your value, they rise to it. They listen when you speak. They pause when you enter. They reflect when you're silent. And that's the difference. Your insight is no longer mocked, it's respected. Your depth is no longer too much, it's admired. Your sensitivity, once labeled weakness, is now seen as the superpower it always was. People come to you for clarity, for calm, for truth. You didn't force anyone to change. You just changed the room you sat in. You stopped adjusting your volume to fit the noise. You found your own frequency, and the world took notice. The contrast is almost poetic. Once they called you dramatic. Now they call you wise. Once they asked you to shrink. Now they ask you to speak. Once they treated your love like an option. Now others beg for a fraction of it. But you don't hand it out like you used to. Love is no longer your currency, it's your crown, and only those worthy enough to understand its weight are allowed to hold it. They thought you were too much. Now they can't find half of what you gave anywhere else. They searched for you in people who don't have your soul. They compared every new connection to a love they failed to recognize when it was standing right in front of them. But you're long gone, not in bitterness, not in revenge, but in evolution, in truth, in a version of yourself so complete, so rooted, so at peace, that even if they said the words now, even if they looked you in the eye and said you were right, you wouldn't hear it. Because the distance isn't just physical, it's spiritual, emotional, eternal. One day they'll say, you were right, but you'll be gone. That's how the story ends. Not with fireworks, not with closure, but with silence. A silence filled not with rage, but with resolution. They'll sit in rooms echoing with memories of your voice, while you sit in spaces they'll never be invited into again. You don't hate them. You don't even think about them. Because your healing journey was never about proving them wrong. It was about becoming someone they could no longer access. You carry no resentment, just distance. You don't need their apologies anymore. You don't need them to understand your heart. You already did the hard work. You understood it yourself. You wrapped your pain in purpose. You turned your scars into scripture. You didn't let what they did define you. You let it refine you. And now, your absence speaks more truth than your presence ever did. That's the part they'll never admit out loud, because their pride won't let them say the words to your face. But they say it in other ways, in the way they watch your stories but never react, in the way they mention your name like it still tastes familiar, in the way they carry the ghost of you into every connection they chase. Because deep down, they know you were the one, the real one. And they blew it. They mistook your loyalty for weakness, your empathy for naivety, your love for convenience. And now they sit in the silence. But for you, it's different now. You no longer walk with the same weight. You no longer question your worth. You've released every version of yourself that used to shrink to fit. You've stepped into a chapter written entirely by your own hands. You don't look back. You don't explain why you had to walk away, because you know now the right ones won't need an explanation. The wrong ones will never deserve one. You've become the lesson, the example, the one that got away and stayed gone. And no matter how far they reach, how deep they dive, they'll never find you in anyone else, because what you gave was real, and real doesn't come around twice. You didn't need revenge. You needed evolution, and that evolution made you unforgettable.